Attacks by both Russia and Ukraine have intensified in recent weeks, with little sign Europe's largest conflict since the Second World War is nearing an end. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of each side and their alliances? And what are the chances of peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. The war in Ukraine has been intensifying in recent weeks with little sign of a peaceful resolution. The toll is unknown. Western estimates say Russia has suffered 1 million dead or injured, while Ukraine has suffered 400,000 killed or wounded. Russia's war economy is surging despite the West's harshest ever sanctions. And Ukraine has launched more audacious attacks deep into Russia while at the same time losing territory. Recent talks in Istanbul have been limited in scope but have led to a prisoner swap. The war is likely to dominate talks at this weekend's G7 summit in Canada, as well as US President Donald Trump's stance, critical for both sides. So what's the balance of power now between Russia and Ukraine? And how and when might the war end? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Ama Boateng.
Russian troops take control of a village in Ukraine's eastern region of Donetsk. More than 3 years since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin's war goes on. For weeks, there have been escalating drone and missile attacks on both sides. That's despite recent talks in Turkey aimed at reaching a ceasefire. One sticking point is territory. Russia says Ukraine must pull out of the 4 regions in the southeast its forces seized in 2022. Luhansk, that it now controls, as well as Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, where it controls around 70%. Moscow wants these regions, as well as Crimea, that it annexed in 2014, to be internationally recognized as Russian territory. Ukraine says negotiations should only focus on the current front lines and that no Russian military gains, including Crimea, will be recognized. The only progress out of the talks so far is prisoner exchanges. In the latest exchange, both sides each handed over prisoners of war under 25. Earlier, Moscow accused Kyiv of delaying the swap. Kyiv denied that and said it was waiting for a list of prisoners to be transferred. The two sides have also agreed to exchange the bodies of thousands of soldiers too. The return of the soldiers' remains opens up the prospect of compensation from Kyiv for relatives unable to file a claim before for someone listed as missing. President Vladimir Zelenskyy is pushing for more military support from his Western backers. And as the attacks continue on both sides, people are left to pick up the pieces. Ama Boateng, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev, Executive Director at the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. In Moscow, Alexander Bratersky, independent journalist and political analyst. And in Berlin, Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. A very warm welcome to all of you. Stephen, I'll start with you in Berlin. How do you assess the current balance of power between the two sides?
At the moment, we have a bit of a stagnation. I mean, Russia in the last year has gained about 1% of Ukrainian territory at a loss of about 1,000 casualties a day. So it's not going very well, and it's not going very fast, and it's not going very far. I would say neither side's particularly winning. The big question is about how long people can last, how much support. There are manpower issues on both sides. There's money issues on both sides. There's equipment issues on both sides. But I think through this year, at any rate, I don't expect to see much change in the front lines.
All right, let's unpick all of those issues. Alexander, the Center for Strategic and International Studies says that Russia's military campaign is on pace to be the slowest offensive campaign in modern warfare. It suffered around 1 million dead or injured. As Stephen said, it's only gained about 1% of Ukrainian territory since January of last year. How much trouble is Russia in?
Well, it's actually, I could agree with this. I mean, with small gains, it's very difficult to explain people why the conflict is still going on, especially with people losing their loved ones in this conflict, in this war. However, the political power is still big, and actually people are united. Most people are mostly united, I would say, because yes, of course, we hear the voices of dissent. The recent attack and the civilian casualties with the train actually just brought people more into sort of like into support of the military efforts, because some people have said about retaliation, and there's a mood about that. Although, of course, is when in every country when we see Ukrainian civilian casualties, of course, people are more saying we need to win this war against Russia. Is the same attitude, the same feelings would be in Russia as well. Even those people might not support the cause of the war, even they don't understand why the war actually happened, and many things, right? But when actually your own people are suffering, not let's say some military which are fighting on the front, and some people are paid for that, that actually brings the war very deep into the minds of Russians. So it's very difficult to.
Alexander, how do you assess that support or that unity in Russia, given the great political censorship there?
Well, by speaking to by speaking to people, of course, the people in my circle, let's say the intellectuals, let's say, they might actually question the situation. They might question the situation, the war itself, the political climate in Russia. But people who have no access to independent media, or they have no access to, let's say, other opinions, it doesn't mean they don't have this access factually. If you want, you can actually get and you can read the news and you can hear the voices of the dissent. But people just don't try not to pay attention. They're more concerned about their own problems with their own economic issues, and that's because the war is not seen in big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, maybe far away. It's actually maybe this is a question. Yes, but the story with the Bryansk train, of course, it was touching for many people, because the people in the train were civilians. Regardless of the situation, I can point one thing: the Russian newspaper Moskovsky Komsomolets, which is not an independent anymore, right, has reported that the train wreckage happened, that the bridge collapsed 30 minutes before the train has arrived. So there was a possibility to save people from the devastation, from death.
Okay.
But because nobody have done it, so that's also a question.
Okay, let's bring Peter in, and we're hearing, Peter, from Alexander, that despite what Stephen describes as stagnation in the war, there is some support in Russia for what's happening. What is the view in Ukraine right now? What are Ukrainians' appetite for war?
Well, we are obviously expecting, this Russian offensive in Sumy to start in earnest. Putin has been threatening that this time it's going to be for real. I mean, it's been already fourth summer of this war. And Putin is counting on a knockout blow against the Ukrainian army. But let me just remind you, and I think it's actually quite a bit of a progress, that our Russian participant is finally calling a spade, meaning war. If you let me remind our viewers, then even 2 years ago, it was criminal offense to call it a war because it was called a special military operation. Well, now, after 1 million casualties of the Russian army, both killed and wounded, finally Vladimir Putin has decided to allow his subjects to call this a war. He went into Ukraine hoping Ukraine to fall within 3 to 7 business days, and we are still here. I suspect that if Ukraine is given finally the ability to bring the war to the streets of Moscow the way we are suffering in Kiev, we just last night we suffered the greatest bombardment, numerically speaking, Russia has ever launched at us. 499 drones with ballistic missiles. It's true enough that as long as people in Moscow and St. Petersburg and these major cities don't feel the brunt of the war there, nothing is going to change. That's why Ukraine needs to be enabled to make it felt in Russia. Having said that, though, I will tell you that the success of last night's attack was quite minimal. We shot down about 95% of all the incoming drones and missiles, which tells you that Vladimir Putin does not have all that many tricks up his sleeve other than his nuclear weapons. So every time we hear about some major retaliation, and this is something that the White House was warning us yesterday, an elephant gave birth to a mouse. We've been able to weather one after another after another. Ukraine still has some resilience in it left.
All right, Stephen, let me bring you in there on Ukraine obviously has resilience. It's shown that. But with the US position under the Trump administration so unclear, what role is Europe willing to play now? How much is it willing to prop up Ukraine? How much is it able to prop up Ukraine, especially with what Peter is saying, Russia planning, a summer offensive, a large-scale summer offensive?
First thing I would say is Ukraine has resilience, but it doesn't have tons of manpower. It's going to have to decide whether to have a draft or not. Because in Russian minds, if the war goes on and on and on and on, Ukraine's going to have a manpower problem. And that is not something Europe can help with. Europe has plenty of money. I mean, no one's expecting the United States, as you suggested, to be providing a lot more money. The US is still providing the last bit of the $61 billion that Biden authorized. That'll run out probably by August, if not before. Europe has the money. Europe is pretty optimistic about being able to support Ukraine through this year and into next, certainly through the summer offensive. Europe is producing and buying artillery shells plus Ukraine's own production, so that's less of a problem. The biggest problem is air defense missiles, which nobody has a lot of, to be honest. And the thing that they really need to keep, that the Ukrainians need to keep, is American operational intelligence, because it's better than anything the Europeans can offer. And by operational intelligence, I mean helping Ukraine understand where Russian forces are massing, where attacks are likely to come from, where the missiles are coming from, and where the best targets would be to shoot at. And that, I think, so far, Washington has not restricted. So I think that's one of the great vulnerabilities. But other than that, I think Europe is confident for this year and into the next. The big question is, what affects Putin's judgment of how long to prolong the war. Some people think he wants to end it. I don't see any real evidence of that, but who knows?
Okay. Alexander, Peter was speaking earlier about how Ukraine doesn't have the ability, and it would make a big difference if it was able to strike at, Moscow and major Russian cities the way that Russia is doing. We heard from the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz at the end of last month, and he said that Berlin, along with the UK and France and even the US, he said, was going to lift restrictions on long-range missiles, which it's so far had in place because it didn't want to be seen as escalating the war and antagonizing Russia. The Kremlin has not responded well to this at all. It's called it dangerous. It said that it's not good for the ceasefire negotiations. Alec, do you see the Kremlin attacking Berlin if Germany does provide Ukraine with these long-range Taurus missiles?
Well, actually, I see that, yes, I heard the German chancellor saying about that, but I think there are sort of like, cards on the table. I don't think so the decision will be made, because, yes, the decision will be very dangerous for Russian authorities to retaliate. Although we hear voices of some radicals who are actually sort of advocating we're going to strike Berlin or so on. It is very good that in this country, in my country, Russian Federation, regardless what people can say about, Yes, those people are not making the most hardest decision. They're not making any decisions at all. They're just political pundits on TV for the propaganda purposes, right? I think the real people who are in charge of the Russian military or the Russian political machine are kind of smarter. They will not, they of course they consider things carefully, and I believe also there are some channels open for talks between various sides of how not to sort of like get this war really out of control for everybody. Because yes, people are speaking about, as a colleague in Ukraine has said about, sort of Putin has the nuclear options left, right? But if you strike nuclear with some country, it's going to be a very dangerous retaliation from another country which also has nuclear capacities or capacities to strike with non-nuclear forces, but also make a hard strike. So I think the sides will avoid this. Despite, yes, that's a hard thing. It's actually hard to be shown.
Okay, I want to talk about the ceasefire negotiations that have been taking place, the moves on the diplomatic front away from the battlefield. Peter, the only thing that's been agreed in 2 rounds of negotiations in Istanbul so far is a prisoner swap, with the two sides saying that they're going to exchange thousands of bodies. That question about thousands of bodies, I've seen reports in Ukrainian media that the law around providing around $500,000 in compensation for families of soldiers who've been killed in active service, that there might be changes to that, delaying it, to 2 years after the war. How is this being viewed in Ukraine? As we've been discussing, Ukraine has lost so many, a bigger part of a smaller army. And now there are reports that families might not receive compensation for that.
And to be honest, frankly, I would be surprised if they did. From the very beginning, that the number was astronomical and it was not sustainable. It probably was set early in the war, and it was set early in the war, when the expectations were pretty minimal that this would last these many years. It hasn't ended yet, and it would cost these many tens of thousands of lives. Ukraine cannot obviously sustain this sort of commitment, and it has resulted in a lot of resentment on the part of the loved ones, the family members of the fallen soldiers, because the government has at some point even, refused to declare them as having fallen in the battlefield precisely to avoid paying this exorbitant amount. So I think that Ukraine is going to revise this law, and the sooner the better, because simply put, it's unsustainable. And very quickly, to your point about the peace efforts, I will say, as a Ukrainian American, it pains me to see the way that Vladimir Putin has been playing the American president. He sees that he can get more concessions from the U.S. side. The U.S. has already given Ukraine de facto, maybe even de jure recognition of the occupied territory. It has given it a pledge that Ukraine will not join NATO, and Putin is still not happy. He sees that, he thinks that he can get yet more from the American president. But the fact that the U.S. president has said he will just walk away from this war if nothing happens, or when talking to Putin for the 4th time the other day, he said that Putin informed him that there would be retaliation, and Trump apparently did not say anything, did not urge him to reconsider. That obviously is encouraging Putin to continue and even to step up his terror of Ukraine's civilians. And this is completely unacceptable, and this is a big shame for me to observe as a Ukrainian American.
Stephen, do you agree with Peter that Putin is playing Trump? I mean, Trump has even tweeted something along those lines in the past, but he just keeps changing his stance on this all the time. And do you also think that these ceasefire negotiations, are they going anywhere? If you look at Russia's terms, which include, a withdrawal from the 20% of Ukrainian territory that Moscow now claims, no NATO membership for Ukraine, caps on the size of the country's military. What do you make of that position, and how much is the Russian position being emboldened by the US president?
I don't think there are serious negotiations underway yet. I don't think Putin wants to get into them right now. He has successfully pushed back Trump's efforts for a ceasefire that might lead to negotiations. Trump himself worried that Putin was, as he said, tapping him along. And I think he's become rather frustrated with Putin, but that doesn't mean he necessarily blames him. The thing about Trump is he's more likely to step away from the whole thing saying, oh, this is impossible, than he is to blame Putin. I mean, there's work going on, as you know, in Congress, particularly in the Senate, to do a bill that would put very serious tariffs on any country that buys energy from Russia. The idea of that is to aim at Russia's oil exports, which would harm the economy a lot. But Trump has been very much silent on whether he agrees with this bill. He has been reluctant. He's warned Putin, but he hasn't done anything about it. And my sense is he still sees past Ukraine. He thinks Ukraine's in the way to this beautiful relationship he wants to have with his pal, Vladimir Putin.
Okay, so big questions around Trump's position remain, but also Alexander, Stephen is talking about the bill in the US Congress, but given that it's asking for something like 500% tariffs on countries that do business with China, more specifically with Russia, like China, that buy Russian oil, isn't that bill a non-starter?
Okay, well, I can say yes, but see, the memorandums on the Russian side, also were seen by and is still seen by the Ukraine as a non-starter. But I could remind that actually the chairman of the Russian delegation, Mr. Medinsky, who is not actually a stupid man, has said that it's not an ultimatum, right? So the bill and the memorandum, of course, they ask for a lot of things that looks like, you cannot really answer them and you could not deliver. But in the process of negotiations, even Russia, I think, can actually back down, I believe, because of the situation, considering the situation in economy, as far as U.S. is also, because Russia is more concerned, yes, about India and China and Turkey, especially, the country which holds negotiations, also is providing a hub for Russian economy, for the Russian goods, and also trade with Russia, the Russian tourists, and so on and so on. Russia really concerns about countries like that, and as well as China is actually having its own position, not dependent on anybody. India and Turkey might actually listen to what U.S. has said, because they also have very good relationship with the United States. So I think that I just want to mention it's good that the sides are talking, even despite the war is continuing, the battle is continuing, the conflict is continuing. It's good that sides are talking, context being established, and it's actually a good sign.
All right, Peter, the two sides are talking, as Alexander is saying, but again, there's been so little that's been agreed. Do you see a middle ground here that could end the war?
At this point, no. I'll be very concise here, and I would actually direct our viewers to actually not, be lazy and go and check out the Telegram channel of Dmitry Medvedev. Let me remind you, former president of Russia in 2008 to 2012, who is engaging in really genocidal rhetoric about Ukrainians for the duration of this war. This is reminiscent of the Radio of Thousand Hills that led to the slaughter of the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1992. He calls Ukrainians cockroaches and insects that have to be exterminated. This is one of his most recent tweets. And actually in that, he is commenting on the reason why Russia is engaging in these peace talks. And he puts it point blank. He says, we're doing it, we're going through the motions, but the end goal is to destroy these insects. Literally his words. I think that's all you need to know about Vladimir Putin's intentions.
Oh, but is it though? Because Alexander, you said earlier that, these kinds of voices in Russia, you believe that they're not those that are surrounding Putin.
Yes, I that Peter has mentioned about the former. Yes, this man was a former president of the Russian Federation, and he's actually expressing those views, are very radical views, even by whatever standards, right? But I don't think so. Mr. Medvedev is actually an actual decision maker. you can see that, interestingly enough, you have the Andrei Belousov, who is the head of the Russian who's a Russian defense minister, who is an economic apparatchik, and his brother is involved in economic observations and puts reports which talk about critical things about Russian economy, and a lot of people point about that. So there is a complexity within the Russian political elite. I wouldn't say it's like this monolith, right? People have different voices. I don't think so the voices of dissent, but some people could say, yes, the economy is not doing well. You see the signs of recession there. People gonna get bills for communal utilities in July, and they're 11% higher. For many people, that's a lot. You're spending money in Moscow, which is 5,000, let's say 5,000 rubles. How much is that? $50? It's already nothing, right? So, just to buy, some necessary products. So people see that. And of course, they understand this is also a part of the whole situation in Ukraine. They also have their neighbors. They also have people who are coming from the military conflict. They also see that. They don't need to listen to television anymore. I don't think so the television is that popular, as it used to be on the propaganda efforts, right? But of course, those voices.
Yeah. Stephen, where do you see all of this going? And do you see Putin settling for anything as a way to end the war that would see Ukraine still being able to defend itself?
I think Alexander is making a very good point. It should be said, it is not a monolithic country. Inflation is at least 21% inside Russia. The oil price is low. The Russians have to face whether to have a draft again. They have adapted technically, but they're still throwing bodies at the front line. They haven't adapted their strategy, and they're not gaining much ground. So my best hope is a relatively frozen conflict for a while, because Ukraine has been pretty good at defending territory with surveillance, with drones, with artillery, with landmines, and it's very hard to gain ground. So Russia can keep this going at a lower pace. We'll see what happens with the summer offensive. I think this will tell us something. But sometimes I think the Ukrainians are better off with no deal than a bad deal. And right now, there isn't a very good deal that Putin is willing, at least publicly, to accept. I don't think he wants the war to go on forever either. But he does have a few red lines, and we haven't reached those yet.
All right, that is our discussion for today. Thank you to all of our guests, Peter Zalmayev in Kyiv, Alexander Bratersky in Moscow, and Stephen Erlanger in Berlin. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.